Hello. And if I retired on those books, I'd make about $15 a month, so self-published. Hello, I'm John Bloom. I'm a conversation designer for Google. And I've been a conversation designer for about 20 years, which is very weird to hear myself say, because people usually think that conversation design is a brand new field. And surprisingly, it's not. You've experienced conversational interfaces when you've talked on the phone with your bank. And I spend a lot of time doing those phone menus. I'm very sorry. But that it does have a long history with a lot of design patterns that we've learned and are still applicable today. So what is conversation design? Google's definition is conversation design incorporates natural, real-world conversational behaviors into the interactions between users and a system. Simply put, we allow people to have conversations with machines. But it is important to point out that it says that we leverage these strategies. We're not trying to act human, but we do take some of the strategy that humans use to solve certain problems. Now, you may ask, well, why do we need conversation designers? Haven't we all had a conversation? Don't we all know how to talk? And that's a good point. We do all know it. And our species has been talking, by the most conservative estimates, about the we've been talking for over 50,000 years. And as individuals, we've been actually comprehending grammatical patterns since the womb. So you would think that there really doesn't need to be conversation designers. But the problem is, we're all so good at conversation, we don't even really know how we do it. Everything that we're doing is pre-conscious. We don't think about it. So it's kind of like riding a bicycle. I'm sure many people here know how to ride a bicycle, but I mean, I know how to ride a bicycle, but if you asked me how I do it, I have no clue. I'm not sure how I keep those wheels up. And as a coworker of mine says, the fish doesn't notice the water. So it's really something that we don't pay attention to, and so our job is partially to make what is pre-conscious conscious. So why am I here to talk to you today? I want to talk about conversation design, but I'd also like to talk about the challenges. And I think they're summarized very well in one of my favorite comedies, The Pink Panther Strikes Again. In that movie, there's a scene in which Inspector Clouseau walks into a small inn in Munich, and he sees a dog. So he says to the man behind the counter, "Does your dog bite?" And the man behind the counter says, "No." So Inspector Clouseau reaches down to pet the dog and gets bitten. So he says to the person behind the counter, "I thought you said your dog doesn't bite." And the man behind the counter says, "That's not my dog." So this summarizes quite well the challenges that we face as conversation designers. Conversation is not smooth. It is not pretty most of the time. Misalignments can happen in many different ways on many different levels. For instance, a person could speak and the signal is not heard by the other person. So they have to say, "Hello, did you hear me?" They could say words and the person doesn't hear the words properly and has to ask the person to speak again. They could hear all of the words perfectly, but not understand the intent underneath. And also, they could understand everything perfectly and not be able to help the person. So these misalignments happen everywhere. But let's not start with the challenges and the troubles. Let's back up and look at the positive for a minute. Let's ask ourselves, well, why do conversation design and why have conversational interfaces in the first place? Well, here's an example of why conversational interfaces can be valuable. How many taps do you think it would take to find out what's 16 times 27? Now, I experimented with this on my phone, and I found it took roughly 14 taps, if you include unlocking the phone, etc., to get to the point where I was getting the answer to this question. And then ask yourself how many taps it would take to play Massive Attack on Spotify. So you have to open the app, you have to type in Massive Attack, etc. So that's a lot of taps. And if you're getting into things like, are there any direct flights to Denver this Sunday, then you're also typing in a lot of things and you're moving from field to field. So there's even more taps going on. So one of the benefits of conversation and voice is that you can shortcut. But there's many other valuable elements to conversational interfaces, and we won't go into great detail about all of these, but it allows us to communicate with computers on our own terms. So the days of the punch cards are way behind us in the rearview mirror, and now we're finally at the point where they're having to adapt to us instead of us adapting to them, which has been a goal for a long time. We're not totally there yet, completely understand. And as another speaker was saying to me today, it sometimes feels like they're speaking another language. So we have a lot of work to do here. It allows us to multitask. So you're driving a car, or maybe your hands are covered with food while you're cooking, and you need to interact with a computer. This is another way that you can do that. It allows us to overcome small targets. So as the form factors in our lives get smaller and smaller, and we move from, large desktop computers, and we're moving down to smart watches, voice lets us get past that hurdle, because Fitts' law dictates that as a target gets smaller, it takes more and more effort to meet the target. It allows us to remain social. So this one isn't spoken about enough. So my children, when they're using their phone, they go into this world and they're tapping away, and I am out of their lives. And I know when I'm tapping on my phone, they're out of my lives too, unfortunately, as painful as it is to admit. But when you're speaking, you're still in a necessarily social environment. So this is a positive. When I'm asking questions of my Google Home, my wife is right there and she's hearing everything I say, so we're still in a conversation together. Understandably, there's another side to that, because at the same time, you sometimes don't want other people to know what you're doing. And some people feel awkward talking in public, so that's obviously a negative of that side. And also, it allows us to rise above literacy and accessibility constraints. So, different countries where the Google Assistant is, there's different literacy rates. And if you're allowed to speak your queries instead of typing, that rises above another hurdle. And obviously for accessibility issues, if somebody has, for instance, repetitive strain injury and can't type easily, then they can still interact with these systems. So as a conversation designer, my job is to know what those benefits are and understand the valuable use cases and bring them to bear in a project. And if something isn't going to lend itself to conversation design, we'll speak up and say, you know what, maybe this is not the best place for us to be using this technology. But the next step is to actually, if we've decided that this is the right time, to actually start designing. And we have a lot of different guidelines for designing. For example, use contractions, just like a human would, and many, many others. But they all sort of fall into the buckets that Paul Grice came up with in the 1950s. He's a cognitive philosopher, and he put forward that whenever we have a conversation with another person, we are always adhering to Grice's maxims. They're not rules, they're maxims. And the reason they're maxims is because they're there to be flouted, bent, stretched, broken, in order to make certain points, like, for instance, sarcasm, etc. The four maxims are quality, that the speaker is trying to tell the truth; quantity, that they're saying as much as is needed, no more and no less; relevance, that they're trying to be relevant; and also manner, that they're trying to speak in a way that's organized and comprehensible. And just to show you some examples of this, we won't go through all of these, but maybe two. So an example of quality, a student says, the capital of Connecticut is Rhode Island. And the teacher says, sure, and the capital of the United States is Canada. Now clearly the teacher on his surface or her surface is lying, because that is not the case. But the student says to themselves in their head, why are they lying? Oh, they're lying because they're trying to make another point, which is that I am incorrect. So the student is assuming the maxim of relevance, and also the maximum, I should say, of quality, and that allows them to interpret the utterance that the person just said. To use another example, let's use the one of manner. So dad says, let's get the kids something. And mom says, okay, but not ICECREAM. So dad has to interpret, why did she spell that out? Obviously, this is unconsciously, and figure out, oh, she spelled it out, which is not what a person would normally do, in order so that the kids are not understanding what's to be said. So these are examples of Grice's maxims, and we're always adhering to these when we're designing in one way or another. Once a conversation designer is actually going to work, we start writing sample dialogues. And this is just an example of a very simple sample dialogue that we might actually write. For visual designers, this might be the equivalent of sketching something on a whiteboard or maybe doing a first draft of something in Sketch. And you can see Grice's maxims at play here. So, for example, the assistant is interpreting England to mean a soccer team and not a country, because obviously a whole country is probably not playing something. So it's interpreting using Grice's maxims, and also when it presents its answer, it's using Grice's maxims of quantity, right? It's figuring out how much do I need to say to this person. And the designers who designed this example right here clearly felt that we should say England as opposed to they, because we want to make sure they know that we understood what they said. Every single word in there, somebody thought about a lot to make sure that it was the right amount of information for this person at this time. But actually, before I get to the next slide, which is kind of interesting, I'd like to say a little bit more about this. When we're doing sample dialogues, a lot of us focus on the happy paths. We focus on what you're seeing up on the screen right now, because these are the times when we're making the world a better place, right? We're doing something that is providing value to the person, and that's where the fun stuff is in conversation design, and also, I'm sure, in other forms of design as well. You want to focus on those things where you're actually showing the value to people. And so it's very annoying, frustrating to go into those places where things didn't go so well. But we know, especially with conversation, that it is not a perfect world. When it comes to speech production, I went the wrong way. When it comes to speech production, people talk with a lot of uhs and ums. And it's very common. It's not like this is an exception to the rule. This is what we do all the time, and I'm sure I've done it a lot already during this presentation. People don't speak like news anchors on television. They speak like humans who are struggling through to make a point. Interesting side note is that and are actually words, and they have meaning. Herb Clark and Gene Foxtree at Stanford have done research in this and have found that there's consistencies on how and when people use these. So, for example, means I need to pause but hold my place in the conversation for roughly 0.25 seconds. And means I need to pause but hold my place in the conversation for about 0.75 seconds. So even though things are weird in conversation and we struggle and we and we there's actually meaning to this. This does actually give information to the person who's listening. I'm not suggesting we say and all the time, because anything that you do over and over and over and over again is going to, probably drive people nuts. But it's okay if you use these. That's not a problem. Anyway, the point being that we do this all the time, and it's something that we need to face as conversation designers. The sentence you're seeing up here comes from a corpus of transcriptions that were done back in the 1970s by Gail Jefferson, who is a psycholinguist and a conversational analyst. And this is just one example among a huge corpus. Two people talking, and one saying, plus for $1 more, you get 5 pounds of veal, 10 pounds of bacon, or other things. But that's not really what the transcription showed. What the transcription showed looked more like this. Plus, for $1 more, you get 5 pounds of veal, or a choice of, or 10 pounds of bacon, or a whole range of things. This is what we look like. This is what we sound like when we talk. We do it all the time. It's okay. This is the nature of conversation. Interesting side note again, they use the word range. And as Gail Jefferson pointed out, people sometimes use a word that's just semantically primed by other things. Range can also refer to something you cook on. And they had just been talking about meat, so it's completely understandable that they just pulled out the word range as the one they were going to use. There were other alternatives, but they chose that one. So, interesting side note, we don't use the perfect word, we use the word that is available. And it's not just on the language production side, it's also on the language comprehension side. When we're listening, things don't always go perfectly. So this comes from a corpus of conversations done in the 1990s by, again, Herb Clark and also Susan Brennan at Stony Brook. And what you're seeing is an example of a good, positive conversation where things go smoothly. And when we're in a conversation, what we're constantly doing is building common ground. We start with just basic common ground. Maybe we speak the same language. Maybe we share the same environment. But beyond that, we don't have much. And as we talk, the two of us start adding to that common ground. And the process is called grounding. And what you're seeing here is positive evidence of grounding. So the person says, and I went to some second-year seminars, and there are only about half a dozen people, and the other person says, And then the person continues and says, and they discussed what a word was. So that says, basically, I understand what you're saying, keep going. But it doesn't always work that way. There's also negative evidence. Person A says, now, do you and your husband have a car? B says, have a car? Person A says, yes. And then B says, no. Common ground and successful grounding wasn't done until you get to the very end. So you start at the very top of that interaction, and you haven't successfully grounded until the bottom. This, again, is not the exception. This is how we talk. When Josh spoke yesterday about what is the grain of the material that you're using, with conversation, it is very crooked timber, to borrow from Immanuel Kant. Crooked timber of humanity. We are not perfect, and we have to struggle through these processes. Michael Reddy, who was a cognitive psychologist, back in the 70s talked about what is called the container metaphor. We often think about language as working this way. I have an idea in my head, and I wrap it in words, and I hand you that wrapped thing like a gift. You unwrap the words, and then you take out the idea inside and put it in your head. It does not work that way. That is almost metaphysical. We can't take something out of our skull and give it to someone else in pristine form. And you can hear the container metaphor in action when you hear somebody say things like, I'm having trouble putting my thought into words. You can hear it in things like, my ideas are not coming across. We do it all the time. But what's really happening is that the listener is trying to reconstruct the meaning based on the sound that you are emanating. So it's a very improv kind of way of understanding the world, and there will always be these misalignments. So conversation designers, we need to understand how that works, be respectful of it, and focus a lot more on when these misalignments happen. I know that many of you are not conversation designers. That's okay. What I'm hoping is that if someday you decide to go into this world, you can understand this field, and also just be a good critic of what you're hearing when you interact with these conversational interfaces. So why should we focus on this? Well, there's a quote from Robert McKee, who wrote a book about story, which teaches screenwriters how to do their thing. And the quote is, true character is revealed in the choices a human makes under pressure. If you haven't seen that exact quote, I'm sure you've come across it elsewhere, maybe on a motivational calendar or a pep talk from a coach. But there is a grain of truth to it, and even Martin Luther King has a quote that's very similar to this one. So there's that rational reason why we need to focus more on these imperfections and make sure that our systems are judged by how they perform in tough times as opposed to how they perform in good times. Now, Google divides the errors that can happen in a conversational interface into 4 different kinds. There are the recognition errors, which we saw a little taste of earlier. There are, recognition errors and also speaker identification errors, contextual errors, and system errors. That's how we break up the world of errors, and I hate calling them errors. I like to call them grounding strategies. So let's look at some examples of these. Recognition errors. Somebody says, set an alarm, and the system says, sure, for what time? The person quietly mumbles 7 a.m., and the system doesn't hear them and simply nods off or what have you. That's an example of what we call in the business a no input, where somebody said something and we didn't hear it and we moved on. There's other kinds of system errors, what we call no matches, where the system heard you but is very not confident about what it heard. And you're very familiar with these, I'm sure. So you say set an alarm, it says sure, for what time? And the person says, and the system comes back and says, sorry, what was that? There's also false accepts, where the system's very confident and understood you, but is totally wrong. So you say set an alarm, it says sure, for what time? You say 7 a.m., and it says got it, 11 a.m. This happens more than we would care for it to happen. Sometimes false accepts are not on the level of words, but on meaning. So, for example, this is my wife, Trisha, and we were out on a date a couple of years ago, away from the kids, and we wanted to go see a movie. And there was a movie that was called Call Me By Your Name. And we were thinking of seeing it. But we wanted to check the trailer out first. So my wife said to the assistant, call me by your name trailer. And the assistant came back and said, okay, from now on, I'll call you by your name trailer. So that is now my wife's name, according to the assistant. Just a little caveat there, this bug has been fixed. But this is a challenge. There are also speaker identification errors, also called voice match errors, where the assistant or a digital assistant should understand who you are, but for some reason didn't catch your voice and so can't give you personal information, for example. There can also be false accepts in this area too. Maybe your name is, I don't know, Jason, and you say, what's my name? And it comes back and says your name's Gretchen, as the completely wrong person. There are contextual errors, where you've said a legit thing and the digital assistant understands you but can't help you out. So for example, you ask for shrimp on your pizza and it says that's not one of the proteins that's offered. Here are some other potential options. And I don't know if anybody has shrimp on their pizza, but I wouldn't recommend it. And then there's finally system errors, and we're all familiar with this. This is certainly not specific to voice, where the system cannot provide information for some reason. Maybe there was some sort of failure on the back end, et cetera. Hopefully, we can still help out in some way as good designers. Now, we've seen the benefits of conversational interfaces. We've looked at some of the errors that can happen when we're interacting with these systems. What can we do to make for a better experience as conversation designers? And if you're not a conversation designer, what should you be listening for to see if we've done our job? Well, first of all, what we can do is we can try to prevent these misalignments before they can even happen and allow for a fluid back and forth where there's nothing but positive evidence, the phrase I used earlier, where everything's pretty much understood and can move forward. And there are ways to do this. Years ago, I worked on a project for Amtrak. Amtrak is pretty much the national train system in the United States. And they had an interesting challenge. We had an interesting challenge where people would say the arrival station, the departure station, the date, and for some reason we had more trouble with the date than we were having with the arrival station, departure station, etc. There was something that just wasn't working. Now we had a grammar, that's the list of things that the system can understand. We had a grammar that recognized dates, and it recognized things like tomorrow and today and Monday and Tuesday, but for some reason it wasn't performing. And it took us talking to customers, novel idea, before we found out what was going on. And it turned out that a lot of people didn't know the date they wanted to travel until they heard what the price was. People were flexible about the date as long as the price was right. So just having a date collection was not good enough. We should have been also listening for things like that depends or let me hear the prices, etc., and it would have gone much more smoothly, and we could have built grammars that would have solved the problem before they could have even happened. And those no-match rates, in other words, the places where the assistant, or I shouldn't say assistant, this was pre-assistant, back when the phone menu had low confidence, wouldn't have had that low confidence experience. Also, conversation designers are often enamored with the idea of natural language understanding. And they think that that means we should be asking all open-ended questions like, what can I do for you? That's a very big, open, wonderful thing. But actually, that causes a lot of existential pain for people because it's too much freedom. It's terrifying. You don't know what this thing understands, what the constraints are, what it knows, what it doesn't know. So it's okay to give more guardrails for people when designing these conversational interfaces, because people do it too. Think about all these kind of phrases or questions that you hear all the time in conversations. Is that to stay or to go? Bubbling or still? Are you thinking a touring bike, a mountain bike, maybe a hybrid? We often structure conversations that way. It doesn't mean you're a robot. It just means that you're being a helpful conversational partner. So this is another way that we can really make these experiences better, is don't shy away from these. It doesn't mean you're designing an old school phone menu. It means you're designing a friendly, helpful interface. Also, as I mentioned earlier, there's lots of little design strategies in conversation design that can help the experience go well. So for example, we try to do things called front loading, which means that you try and give all the information to answer a question before you ask the actual question. You see an example here of front loading. We have small, medium, and large. Which would you like? As opposed to saying something like, which would you like? We have small, medium, and large. What happens if you do it the second way is that people start answering the moment the question is up. And you interrupt them by saying, we have small, medium, and large, and they start going, and it starts leading or setting up a misalignment between the two of you. So there's many other design strategies like this, but this is just an example of one of them that can help avoid this problem. Second, know how and when to ask again. So you have seen this, or I should say you've heard this before. You may not know it, because you may not be a conversation designer, you may be in another field, but anytime you've called a company or you've interacted with a Google action, this is the structure that happens all the time. The designer creates an initial prompt, which is the question that they asks right off the top of the, right off the bat. See, that's how language works. And they say something like, the assistant will say, I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 100. What's your first guess? So that's the initial question. Now, if the person says nothing, they will design what's called a no input prompt, which will say something like, I didn't hear anything, say your first guess between 1 and 100. Person says nothing again. It'll come back one more time and say, sorry, I still didn't hear anything. Please say a number between 1 and 100. And then, if the person mumbles, it might say something like, I didn't understand, and say something similar to no input 1, and then it goes from there with a no match 2, and then finally, when everything bails out, there's a thing called max error, where it just says, sorry, I can't help you, and it shuts down. Now, understandably, we need reusable patterns in order to scale up. So something like this it's completely understandable. But we have to be sensitive to users, because this kind of experience can be maddening for people. David Wheeler at CNN.com said something to the effect of, when I hear a computerized voice dripping with mock concern saying, sorry, I didn't understand, I am apt to fly into a rage. And that is a very legitimate sentiment, and it's what drives people nuts in with our systems. It's something we need to overcome, that sorry, I didn't understand, in a very structured way. It's giving us a bad reputation. And if that's not enough, there's also the data. Google has done research a couple of years ago where we found that roughly 54% of people say that when they hear something say, sorry, I didn't understand, they get angry. And another 5% say they're confused. So we really need to address this spot on. So another thing that we can do within that space is we can write these kind of reprompts in a way that is helpful for people as opposed to frustrating. What conversation designers often do is they'll just write a stock reprompt that they use everywhere that just says, sorry, please say that again. But imagine this situation. Somebody says, play animal trivia. And the system comes back and says, sure, here's your first question. But then their child is in the room and says something like, Mommy, there's a fly in the milk. And so the person says, I didn't hear the question. I don't know what just happened. And it'll come back and say, please say that again. Well, I don't know. There's nothing I can do. I've not heard the question. It's a very easy solution that the reprompt can simply rephrase the question, maybe in a shortened version. That right there will solve a lot of the problems, and it'll decrease the number of no matches that the person will experience. Also, do you need to do it twice after the initial question? Do we have to go back and say, sorry, I didn't hear that, sorry, I didn't hear that, over and over? Maybe the stakes are so low in this conversation that you can just give up. So for example, somebody says set an alarm, and the assistant comes back and says, sure, for what time? Person says nothing. Let's just bail out. Let's leave them alone. The stakes are low. We're not too deep into the conversation, so if we lose the conversation, it's not a problem. But if you're talking about money and you're deeper in the conversation, then maybe it's time to increase the stakes and actually try harder to solve the problem. So in this case, you can see somebody's transferring funds, they're having a side conversation with their partner, and so the system's having trouble understanding, and it will keep trying. So also, we don't have to give too much information when we come back and try and help the person. So we don't have to say something like, sorry, I didn't understand. How many people are on the reservation? For example, you could say 4. Maybe we can just do what we call a rapid reprompt, and right away just come back, say, sorry, for how many people? Maybe the first time that's going to be good enough. And we have seen that. I did some research, oh my gosh, 10 years ago, where we were comparing those more long-winded first retries with shorter ones, and we found no difference. I'm not going to say that the shorter prompts were better or led to more efficiency, et cetera. There was no difference. But if you have a choice between a shorter interaction and a longer one, why not go with the shorter one? Third, know how and when to stop asking. We've all heard systems say, sorry, something went wrong, and just, that's it. Or it said something like, sorry, I'm just not understanding, and bails out. But that's not very conversational. It's not very friendly. It's rather cold. From People and AI from Google, we have a quote that says, focusing on what your users can do after the system fails empowers them while maintaining the usefulness of your product. And by the way, I don't think this just goes for conversational interfaces. This goes for other interfaces as well. Just giving up and bailing is never the right thing to do. Try and be helpful. Try and get them over this hurdle. If you're in a restaurant and the waiter goes to get your order of salmon and then comes back and just says, sorry, we're out of salmon, and that's fine. You know, that's a decent waiter. But a good waiter would say something like, sorry, we're out of the salmon, but the grilled Arctic char is really good. It's my favorite. That helps you. It makes you say, oh, maybe there's something, maybe I'll go that way. Thank you. So we see this in conversation design. Here's an example of somebody saying to the Google Assistant, when's my next meeting? And reaches one of these speaker identification errors. And instead of just giving up and saying, I don't know who you are, it will send them a text message to their phone where the account was set up, and they can continue from there making the reservation. Fourth and finally, consider multimodal solutions. You don't always have that option. If you're designing for the Google Home, you've got potentially one interface, although from the last example, from the last slide, you can see maybe you can send a text message, et cetera. But there are benefits to voice, as we discussed earlier. But one of the challenges of voice is that it is serial. In other words, you can only present one piece of information at a time. Visuals are great because they're massively parallel. You can present a whole bunch of information at once, and a person can go through it and use it at whatever they need in whatever order they want. So sometimes error recovery is best on a screen. So this is an example of a screen for the Google Assistant on an Android phone. And there's a misrecognition that happened there. What you might not see there is that there's a little thing that says edit. And now you can go in and you can edit what you tried to say so that the Google Assistant can do the right thing. And also, it has an algorithm where it's learning from that, so it can next time not make the same mistake. And of course, there's the buttons on the bottom. And we can use the screen for recovery using some sort of graphic user interface as opposed to voice. So when it gives up on a timeout, instead of just saying, sorry, when was that alarm for? And then just gives up, shuts down, no more. So the value here is that the screen, that screen where they can enter the time, is going to be there for as long as we need. So they can come back and answer in 5 minutes. And the microphone doesn't have to be open and listening. It can shut down. And also, on our smart displays, Also, if it has some issue with the intent, it doesn't quite understand your intent, then it can come up with similar intents and see if maybe those will be helpful. The odds might be lower, but maybe it'll help out. So these were the 4 things that we covered that can prevent those misalignments or remedy them in a humane way. And if you become conversation designers, I hope that you will consider these. If you're in another field but you use these assistants, I hope you'll be listening for these to figure out where we could be doing a better job. Now, since we had the theme of music, I'd like to give a little coda here. This is not originally part of this talk, but I wanted to talk about it because, Katie Mogul was supposed to be speaking here today, and she couldn't make it, and she comes from user experience research at Google. And user experience research is very important. And I'm not in that group, so I hope I do it service. And I know that Melissa's here, who spoke yesterday from YouTube. She can keep me honest, so ask her if I was accurate about this. But I'd just like to say that with conversation design and from that Amtrak example, you can see that research is critical to doing this right. Conversation is complicated, but it's not unpredictable. Those ums and uhs we talked about before, yes, they're messy, but they do have a logic within them. And by talking to humans, you can find out what some of that logic is. Like the example of you don't know what date you want to travel until you know what the price is. So at Google, do we use usability labs? Of course we do. We have to do user research, and sometimes we need to do it on-prem, and that happens. But we've learned that that environment can sometimes be rather cold, and also it's hard for people to get there. And so what we try and do is actually get out into the field quite a bit, and go out and talk to people in their natural environments. So there is a Google user experience research van that's traveled all over the United States. But then there will also be teams that go overseas. For example, in India, we have a team that will stress test using Google Maps by just roaming around with Google Maps out in the field in Kolkata and trying to figure out, is it actually valuable? And finding the problems with that experience and going back and trying to improve it. The process, this might look very similar to a process you might use for user experience research, but a couple of things to point out. First of all, that first step is empathy. It's not just going out and learning about what the details are. It's trying to get into the feelings, the moods of the people out in the field who are trying to use your products. And as the example from the previous slide showed, trying to actually use, for example, maps while you're on a bus in Kolkata. And also evolve. Evolve just doesn't mean improving the product. It means changing our culture so that it works better in the future, our whole process of doing user experience research. What worked, what didn't work. Try and improve on that a little bit each time we go through. In terms of conversation design, this process is pretty much the same for conversation design. There's little differences, like during the empathy moment, you also have to be asking yourself, is this a place I want to be using voice? Right? Is this, are my hands busy? Are my eyes busy? If they're not, maybe we don't need voice in this situation, maybe? So we have to ask those critical questions about whether voices or conversation is really the right solution. And also, when we're doing, this is a small thing, but during usability testing, you can't do the think aloud protocol where you ask people to think their thoughts while they're doing a task because they're also supposed to be talking to the system. So that's one challenge. So that's my talk. I strongly encourage you, if you want to hear more or read more about conversation design, go to actions.google.com/design. There is more than you probably want to know there. It's a lot of information, but rather valuable if you're thinking about this field. And also these 2 books by my colleagues, Kathy Pearl and James Jangola. The interesting thing about James Jangola's book is that even though it was written a while ago, people haven't changed how they talk very much. And how they talk to machines hasn't changed all that much either, so there's a lot of valuable information still in there. Thank you very much for your time.
Hello, John.
Hello.
Many questions. Let's start with one of the last slides. You have prototyping right in the middle of the development process. We'd like to hear more about how you prototype this kind of stuff. What's involved in prototyping a conversation?
It's a good question. It is not easy. A lot of what we will do are Wizard of Oz studies, and I don't know if that's common in other fields or other forms of user experience research other than conversation design, but basically we'll have a person behind a wall who will be typing in things to make an assistant pretend to be an assistant when it's actually just a person behind a wall that's typing in the things. So it's not a prototype, it's a simulated conversational interface. So that's one thing we'll do. Also, we do have user experience developers who will create sort of rapid they'll do some very small, quick and dirty actions on the Google Assistant that will simulate what we want to do at a lower resolution, using things like our dialogue flow tools, et cetera.
Cool. There are quite a few questions about localization, differences in geography, colloquialisms,
Yes.
funky phrases, that kind of thing. What can you say about how you work that into your process?
Yeah, it's a tricky one to scale. As a person from the United States, I should not be designing for France. I should not be designing for England. So we try to have designers from those backgrounds working in those areas, because it's not just translation, it is absolutely localization. And I don't know the subtleties of US English versus UK English, those regional differences. Now, the United States is a big place with lots of different regions. Unfortunately, we do have to sometimes just, have a designer who is American working in the United States, and we can't have somebody from the South designing for the South, et cetera. So we do try and localize as much as we can, but it is also a challenge.
Got it. What are some of the ethical challenges that come up in this line of work?
Yeah. Well, I think that one of them that comes up quite a bit is actually the recognition accuracy for women versus men. That is one that has been a challenge for quite some time, and it's quite similar to the issues with face recognition and other ones that come up, because the models are trained on people of a certain group, and then it just doesn't track for other people. So that's one of the challenges, is trying to get the core technology, the speech recognition technology, to work for more people. And also, obviously, one that comes up a lot is that you've got this speaker in your home. Obviously, that's a big challenge. As a user experience person, I'm the advocate for the user. When I go into meetings, I am trying to do that 100%. I have a family and I have a Google Home in my house, and I don't want it listening all the time. So, we try and be very sensitive to that and do the right things there.
Mm-hmm. What advice do you have for someone who wants to get into the field of conversational design?
Read those books that I had up on the screen. Write a book where you have to write dialogue, or maybe just a short story. But actually writing out dialogue and trying to be true to how people actually talk is a really core basic thing that sometimes people skip, because we think we know how people talk, but then when we actually listen and try and transcribe everything, it's quite different. We often will fall to what we hear phone menus do. I was like, sorry, I didn't understand, and please listen closely as our options have changed. And that's not how people talk. Try and listen to how people actually talk.
Are you the voice I get when I call? No.
No, I'm not.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
It sounded like it.